Hey, how you doing? This is Gavin from Gavin's Guitar Tips. I'm excited today to share with you a way to use chords to create interesting progressions by basically realizing that you can play a good sounding chord from any note. So not just any note in the scale, but any note even outside of the scale, which can give us some really cool outside, I don't know, funky sounds, right? So here's a little example. So the concept we need to start with is, what are chords? Where do they come from? How can we find them within a key? So right now I'm going to use E minor as my example key. And so there's 7 notes in a scale. That's how our normal diatonic scale system works, which means we're going to have 7 very obvious starting points where we can play a chord. Those 7 starting points also can be thought of as modes. I can think of them as minor, then Locrian, then major, then Dorian, then Phrygian, then Lydian, Mixolydian, back to minor. And what we can also think is that each one of those modes usually has a certain chord that comes from it. So minor, we're going to find, has a minor chord, minor also known as Aeolian. The way that we figured this out, to find the chord that comes from a certain part in the scale, is you have to figure out the 1st, 3rd, and 5th note. So if you know your modes, your 3-note per string system, this will be quite simple, right? Because we can think of, okay, if I start from minor, I have my 3rd note and my 5th note, which makes a minor triad. A minor chord comes from a minor triad, minor 3rd, perfect 5th, right? I keep working through all those. I'll find out that there are 3 types of chords that we normally get from our 1st, 3rd, and 5th note. We have a minor chord, like in minor, major chord, like in, that's Lydian, for example, and then we also have a diminished chord from Locrian. So you're just going to have to memorize that, and it gets easier over time, knowing that we have 3 minor chords coming from minor, coming from Dorian and Phrygian, and then we have 3 major chords coming from major, Lydian, and Mixolydian. You can also think of these spots as, oh, that's G major, and that's C major and D major. I tend to not think in note names, and I encourage people to think in terms of modes or the spot in the scale where we are, right? When people say, oh yeah, this is like going from our 3 to our 6 to our 7, I get what they mean, but the thing is, those numbers, the 3rd step in the scale, the 6th step in the scale, 7th step in the scale, that changes depending on whether we're calling it a minor scale or a major scale. So I tend to like thinking of it as, oh, I'm going from major to Lydian to Mixolydian, because I don't know, maybe I am in a minor key, maybe I'm in a major key, right? And the numbers are going to change, right? If that's a major key, this is now a 1, 4, 5, right? But if it's a minor key, again, those are different numbers, right? So I like thinking of it in modes. I challenge you, when you go through a chord progression of a song, you know, think of it as, what steps in the key are this, right? What modes are associating with these starting points that these chords are from that I'm playing. So that's a lot of talking about chords and sort of the background of them, how we can find each chord from a scale. So this is sort of the prerequisite for this, is that you have to be able to take a key. I'm in E minor. First you find all the starting points, right? So knowing all those notes, where we can find notes that are in the key, and then you got to know what chords come from those notes, right? So we have our basic triad chords. I mean, we have E minor coming from the mode of Aeolian. We have F sharp, Locrian, coming from Locrian, which is a diminished chord. Sorry, lots of terms here. Music theory has lots of terms. Major, from our Ionian mode, our major chord. I'll just keep going through it. Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, and then back to minor. So you got to get those down. That already gives you a ton of great options to build cool chord progressions, just knowing the right chords in the key. Now, the next thing that's very cool, and why I wanted to make this video today, is we're going to look at basically the notes that are outside the key, right? So we have 12 notes in total in music, if we count up A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and all those sharps. But our normal scale, our normal diatonic scale is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 notes in it, right? So there's 5 extra notes that are missing. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about each of those extra places, because you can think of them as extra notes that you can use as sort of passing notes or passing chords between 2 places. So let's start with the example of going from the Mixolydian major chord, 7th chord of the minor key, back to the 1 minor chord coming from minor mode, right? Instead of just transitioning like that from one chord to the next, we can add in another chord in between. And so what am I doing there? Oops, wrong chord. The extra chord that I'm adding, literally all I'm doing is I'm taking the last chord I played, which is a major chord from Mixolydian. It's our 1st, 5th, our 1st again, and our major 3rd. And then what I'm doing is I'm just moving the 1st up. So I have the 1st interval there. I'm going to sharpen it. Right now, this is a note outside of our key. I'm going to sharpen this note as well, which is the octave of it. So we went from having, now we're just changing the 1st note and the octave to B sharp. And really, this is my first basic trick I'm going to recommend for you, which is that when you have to go between 2 chords, right, and there's a note between it in the scale, what you can do is just play the chord that you played before, sharpen the 1st note, and it gets us to the place that we want to go. Right? So in this case, this is a diminished chord that we ended up getting. Right? If you sharpen this major chord, if you sharpen the 1st note, we go from having a root, perfect 5th, major 3rd, to now we have root, minor 3rd, flat 5, and the tritone. Sometimes it's not always the diminished chord that you get, but it usually always will sound good. So for example, let's go from our minor chord to then thinking, okay, what's the next spot in the scale? Well, we have from minor, the mode, then we go to our 2, our Locrian, diminished. And how do we get between those? Well, all we're going to do again is we're going to sharpen the 1st, right? We're going to sharpen the minor chord, just the 1st interval. So leave everything else the same, but move these. And I love this, so eerie. And then we can move right to that diminished chord, and it gives us a transition, right? From, instead of going from here to here, we have this nice, oops, I played it wrong. See, it sounded a bit weird because I'm adding in another note that's outside the scale that wasn't the 1st interval. And that sometimes is risky. I wouldn't recommend that for this sort of safe transition move. You can just keep walking through the scale. Here we have major. We're about to hit Dorian next, Ionian to Dorian, our 3rd to our 4th, our 3 to our 4, however you want to think of it. What I'll do here again is I'll just sharpen the 1st. And now, when we sharpen the 1st again of a major chord, we have a nice diminished chord, which transitions nice. So what you can do, there's 5 extra transition points, right? There's a spot between the minor mode and Locrian, we talked about. There's a spot between major and Dorian, which we just saw. And then there's going to be a spot between Dorian, minor chord, Phrygian, minor chord, which again, the same thing. I'm going to leave the 5th and the 3rd the same. I'm just going to raise the 1st interval. And it transitions nicely to that next chord. And then we have Lydian to Mixolydian. Again, we can do the same thing. Mixolydian to minor, same thing. And those are all of our transition spots. So that's our safest way, is what do you do to get from one chord to the next? If they're right next to each other, just sharpen that 1st note. But the thing is, we'll find that there's a few other ways we can do this. There's lots of kind of cool chords we can get from these in-between notes, right? These notes that are technically outside of the key. Another way to do it is imagine that we're descending through some chords. Instead of going up through it, let's go down, right, from minor, also known as Aeolian. By the way, I never say the Greek names. If you're like, why is he saying minor and major? Why? You could also think of them as Aeolian and Ionian. Minor, Mixolydian, Lydian, also thinking of it as 1, 7, 6. I don't think that way, but there you go. All we're going to do is we're going to now flatten the 1st note of each chord we just played. So I had my minor, and I'm going to flatten it. to my Mixolydian, flattening the first note. And then what I did there, I teased you with some other chords that sound good, which is you'll find at certain sequences in the scale, some things sound good that aren't exactly just moving the first note. So one I love between Lydian and Mixolydian, and between Mixolydian and minor, is this sort of special chord. What we're doing is we are borrowing the fifth from the next chord, right? So every time the first is in between the two chords, right? So I'm between this C and this D. Those are my notes in the scale. We're making this a sort of C sharp in between. That's our first interval. And then I'm going to use the fifth from the chord I'm going to, right, from that Mixolydian chord. And then I'm going to use the third, the major third from the chord I just left. So it's almost like you have the note in between the two chords, and then you have a bit of the chord you're going to and a bit of the chord you're leaving, right? So it's just this beautiful transition sound, which I love. Okay. So another thing to think about here is probably the most obvious chord, in my opinion, to borrow, specifically meaning the root note is going to be from outside of this key, is the Mixolydian sharp 1 note, aka the seventh of minor, seventh degree of minor, and that's because that's the harmonic minor sound. All right. So this is what I tell my students too, is that natural minor and harmonic minor, I think, are so easy to switch between naturally. People don't even really realize that it's like a special weird type of scale or something, because hearing this extra, just this one extra chord, so natural. Hearing that. And basically all harmonic minor is, Phrygian dominant is a mode of it. There's all these different modes of it that are just altered versions of our normal scales, our normal modes, I should say. All you're doing is you're sharpening the Mixolydian note. Right, so if we have Lydian, oops. All we do is we sharpen the second, because that's the note that Mixolydian starts from. Becomes. So if we think of this, usually from a Mixolydian chord, the first note gets raised. And now this is sort of from the harmonic minor key. What else is from harmonic minor is if we think of that note changing from there to there, right now we're changing it as this is the first of the chord, but this will also be the third of a certain chord. And that certain chord is Phrygian, right? Instead of that third being there, it's now Phrygian dominant, right? Which makes Phrygian, instead of having a 1, 3, 5 that is a minor third, a minor chord, like technically that's the true chord that comes from Phrygian. We have this, a major chord from Phrygian. So this is why you might have wondered to yourself, why does it sound so good to, play through our normal sequence of chords? I'll try to do it well. So you might have heard what I did there is I went from all the chords were the normal triads you'd expect from that starting point in the scale, except for Phrygian. That note is technically outside of the key. That's that sharpened Mixolydian note that is from harmonic minor. So we have a major chord there for Phrygian instead of a minor chord. And I think the reason that's so acceptable is because, again, in sort of the way I look at it, is that note being sharpened is like the most normal note that our ears can expect to change. So really, this is having that major chord for Phrygian is we're expressing Phrygian dominant, a part of harmonic minor. So yes, normal things to change, I would say, is throwing in this part, throwing in that thing, and then if you think of it, that's our first changing, our third changing, and then the fifth would be the fifth of major. To sort of express just that one note changing. But basically, I would encourage you just to experiment with this. Try to see that there's sort of unlimited possibilities with what kind of extra chords we can have, even if the root note is outside of the key. The whole lesson here, the takeaway, is that even if the root note is outside of the key, as long as the chord tones, the third, the fifth, whatever else is going on there, are from chords that are already in the key, it will kind of sound okay, and it will sound cool even. Here's one more example. If we look at our seventh chords, Lydian, major seventh, Mixolydian, dominant seventh, minor seventh for minor, right? What we can do to make that more interesting is keep those exact chords. All we're going to do is we're going to add in those sort of passing tones. Oops. Just sharpening the first note, right? Normal chord, sharpened first note, onto the next one, sharpened first note, and finished. And the thing is, you can even find situations where it sounds good just to jump to the chord that's technically out of the key. See, that's not in the key. And then I drop down to a chord that is. That's not in the key. And I drop down to one that is. All right, that's my lesson. I thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this. Please let me know other ideas you have for good topics to talk about. If you do want private lessons, you can contact me on Instagram, or you can send me an email. Sometimes I'm a bit slow to getting back to people. I have a lot of students right now. My schedule is quite full, but I'm still open to trying to get more people in when I can. It's just sort of a matter of scheduling. And that's all I got for you. Have a great day, and please continue to enjoy guitar.